Bob, would you mind discussing a little bit about Korzybski's major works, Manhood of Humanity and Science and Sanity?
Okay, and I may even say a little bit about the two time binding papers of 1924 1926. All right, Korzybski's first major work was called Manhood of Humanity, which has been translated into Italian as The Adulthood of Humanity by an Italian feminist. But as far as I know, it's a good translation. And I approve of that shift. Uh, of course, Korzybski learned English uh, starting in 1916. He published Manhood of Humanity in 1921. And of course, manhood, as used in the English-speaking world, was the term that he learned. And of course, that to him meant humanhood. So he was not being sexist, as we would say today, in using that term. All right, Manhood of Humanity, I would suppose that the major thing that Korzybski formulated in that book, which became really the basis of what became general semantics, fully enunciated in 1933 in Science and Sanity, was the notion of human beings functioning as time binders. Now, it had been observed, ever since Aristotle, that there were sort of classes of organic life, vegetative, animal, and human. What Korzybski accomplished with this definition is setting limits. A definition, de fide. The purpose of a definition is to set limits to whatever it is that you're defining. So he enunciated the vegetative life as chemistry or energy binding. He considered plants, for example, as solar batteries. They were stored solar energy, which were eaten by animals who he called space binders, because although they were energy binders, and by binding he meant, used it in the chemical engineering sense of organizing stuff to promote your own well-being, your own functioning, your own survival. So he called animals a space-binding class of life, because even though they were energy binders like plants, they were not fixed in space-time, but they could move around. They could use space in order to promote their own survival. Humans he considered time binders, because although they were also energy binders, if you've ever farted, you certainly know that. You like that? And of course, obviously, we humans are space binders. Doug studied the piano and other music in Warsaw. He studied economics in Canada, and he was born, I believe, in Glen Burnie before living much of his life in Baltimore, before binding space to an even greater extent. So we're obviously space binders too. But in addition to that, a very overarching difference, we are time binders in the sense that we can use time to promote our own development, well-being, etc. I am speaking a language that was invented by people long dead. I know a few things that were discovered and formulated by people long dead. So we can get from the past information, we can add to it in the present, and then ship it off to future generations. That's what Korzybski meant by time binding. But the important thing is that he considered the time binding to be the defining characteristic of the human class of life. And that's very important. He rejected theological and zoological explanations of what makes a human. He said, there's one thing that humans do that no other class of life does is bind time. Today, many of us in the field of general semantics like to say bind space-time, because as Korzybski well knew, that we ever since Minkowski's mathematization of Einstein in 1908, I guess it was, Einstein's first relativity paper was in 1905, ever since 1908, as Minkowski pointed out, we should not talk about space by itself or time by itself, certainly not some objectified time, but space-time, recognizing that we have three measurements in space related to extended stuff, and one measurement in time. And I emphasize that time, for both Einstein and Korzybski, was simply a measurement, not a thing in the sense of something that flows, you know. We still today, in fact, I would say the majority of people who talk about time talk about it in an objectified way, as though it's some kind of something like that camera that I'm talking into right now.
Or Chopin's Minute Waltz.
Yeah, right. However, the word that I have is that Chopin intended minute. And he did not intend for Liberace to put a stopwatch on his grand piano.
Right.
So anyway, so that's the core notion of Manhood of Humanity. However, he talked about a lot of other things. He talked about this time-binding function leading, perhaps so optimistically, to an inevitable process of progress in human living. And he said that this progress was an exponential function of time, that you had work being done, but then over time it was constantly being added to and revised, etc., so that it would be leading to well, he observed that this seems to work in scientific work and in engineering. For example, if engineers build a bridge and it collapses, they have the means by which to say, well, why the hell did it collapse? Let's fix it and go on. He observed that in social structures, we don't seem to do very well. We keep repeating the same errors over and over and over again because we're not sufficiently aware of what the hell we're doing at the social level. The sciences are characterized by a high degree of awareness of what is it that we're trying to do, what results are we trying to achieve, and how can we achieve them in a way which is paying attention to the facts that we have at hand at time t, you know, today and tomorrow and the next. But in this book, he also applies his notions to economics, biology, and engineering. And I think those parts of the book are what caused the most excitement among practitioners in Korzybski's day. The response to that book was really remarkable. Uh, Within 2 years, there had been 4 printings of it, made necessary by the sales, of the book. And he was much reviewed and discussed. And from that point on, he was a world figure. So, ask me a few more questions about the Manhood of Humanity.
Yeah, when
anything that you want to know about, because I think what I just said is a fair but very overall summary of central themes in the book. But
when was it written?
What's that?
When was it written?
In 1920 and published in 1921.
And the book was distributed.
By 1923, it had the 4th printing.
Where was it distributed?
Where?
Mm-hmm.
Well, all over the world. But it was published by E.P. Dutton, and so it was an American publication, and it was marketed by Dutton, and had ads and.
I mean, was it for general public consumption, or was it for university scholarly type of work?
He intended everything that he wrote for general consumption, for the famous intelligent man in the street. As one reviewer wrote, and I think it was about manhood, he said, "Never before has the average intelligent man in the street been more flattered."
Now,
but it made a very big impact.
How was it received among intellectual circles here in the United States and in Europe?
Very well, very well. He had correspondence from India, writing, asking about that book and discussing the notions that he presented in that book. China, I mean, all over the world, really. Lots of Europe, but much reaction in the Western Hemisphere.
Now, after he wrote Manhood of Humanity, what triggered him to come up with an idea to author such a magnanimous tome as Science and Sanity? I mean, that is a very big and substantial work.
Well, he realized that, this was the process. He was educating himself as he went along. I've often pointed it out to people, especially with relation to Science and Sanity, who say, well, gee whiz, Korzybski wrote this book, and yet he often did things that were quite contrary to what he calls for in the book. I said, well, you have to realize that he was not only inventing this stuff, but he was having to teach it to himself as he went along and try to make his behavior a reflection of what he was writing. I said, that's a big struggle.
Now, did the title of the book, Science and Sanity, come before the book was finished, or was it an afterthought?
Well, it was actually suggested, I just learned recently, at this conference in Las Vegas, at the University of Las Vegas, Nevada, that someone who I don't remember quite at the moment suggested it to him just before he published it. Someone that he was conferring with. It's a well-known name, but I just don't recall it right now. But before talking about Science and Sanity, we should mention that after the publication of Manhood of Humanity, Korzybski was in great demand all over the country to lecture. He lectured at universities. He lectured at at Masonic lodges. He published actually in a Masonic journal called The Builder, They were very interested in his work. Uh, he lectured at the behest of bishops of all critters, uh, various clubs of intellectuals, business groups, political groups, U.S. government groups, all kinds. This book really stirred up a lot of interest and commentary. Well, he realized that, of course, Science and Sanity, the Manhood of Humanity was just really the starting point, because he had the notion to build a great system, not to express, just to express opinions, but to organize all the stuff that he knew about and was thinking about into a system which could be taught and imparted to people. His concern was to actually donate to the world a set of formulations that would ameliorate the human condition, as it's called. Well, this was a process. This was an evolution, the starting point of which was Manhood of Humanity. In 1924 and 1926, he published two papers called Time Binding, the General Theory. And those two papers are a very succinct statement of what became Science and Sanity. So they're very important for anybody who's a student of Korzybski's work. Cannot qualify as an adequate student, let's say, unless they have studied, not just read, but studied the time-binding papers. They are very, and they're stated in a very lively, pungent language that is very, 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 very impressive. Well, then after the time-binding papers, he went on to start working on on Science and Sanity, and that was a process from 1926 to 1933, where in the last minute he was inserting changes because he decided to use the term general semantics, which he had not been using before. And also, somebody suggested the title Science and Sanity. Well, Science and Sanity, for which I've written the preface to the 5th edition, which is now out in its second printing, which I think we already showed before. A monster book. It's in its present form, counting the index, is 825 pages. Now, that's not exactly what, a Hawthorne novel, is that what they're called? It's not even King, something like that. It's a tough book. I didn't find it all that tough when I first read it. I had just graduated from a Jesuit college where I did pretty well in philosophy and Aristotelian Thomistic studies. And when I was first reading it, I was saying, because I was reacting as a good Aristotelian certaintist. And even though I'd questioned some of the stuff I was hearing at Loyola, the Jesuit school that I attended in Baltimore, but as I read along, and particularly in the second, in the introduction to the second edition, which is a monograph length thing, and has been published as a separate piece in itself, where I got the neuro-linguistic point that I mentioned earlier today. And from that point on, I decided, well, I really have to start paying attention to what the hell this guy is writing. So I did. And, well, what did Korzybski say in Science? It said in 800 plus pages that I can impart to you in a few minutes. Well, I can't do it. Well, I can give you some indication. I think the central thing to realize about Science and Sanity is that drawing on the work of others, as a good time binder should, Korzybski organized this material into a coherent system. Well, here, let me quote myself in this flyleaf here. This is from the preface to the 5th edition. Korzybski was not only a bold innovator, but also a brilliant synthesizer of available data into a coherent system. This system, when internalized and applied, can create a saner and more peaceful world, justifying the title of this book, Science and Sanity. Now, the key to that effectiveness, seems to me, is precisely Korzybski's paying attention to the formulating brain. Brains are us, as my popular book is going to claim. And Korzybski realized that all of the stuff that he was doing, all the philosophical systems, etc., are produced by human brains. In some language, which these philosophers and scientists have learned from childhood, and that the structure of this language greatly predisposes us to see the world in terms of that language structure. Before Worf, who's often given credit for this so-called Worfian hypothesis, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that the structure of a language greatly predisposes us to see the world in accordance with that language structure, Korzybski anticipated that independently. And that's the core of the importance of Science and Sanity and general semantics. Korzybski claimed that he was formulating the first non-Aristotelian system, with general semantics as its methodology. First the system, and then now here are some tools that you can use to make the system work, to help things out. Well, what did he mean by non-Aristotelian? He certainly did not mean anti-Aristotelian. In fact, Aristotle is one of the people to whom he dedicates his book. And these people to whom the book is dedicated, he says about them, to the works of 40 or so famous thinkers, philosophers, from Aristotle to Wittgenstein, which have greatly influenced my inquiry, this system is dedicated. So he's a very conscious time binder. He knows where he got his stuff. What he's doing is making a system. So by non-Aristotelian, he meant a system that does not deny the Aristotelian system, but is broader and goes beyond. He used to have a diagram in which he described non-systems with relation to the systems with which they are none, and have a circle and then a little circle inside. And in the case of Aristotle, this little circle would represent the Aristotelian system, A, and the larger circle, which encircled the Aristotelian system, would be labeled A with a bar over top, which is a scientific way of indicating none, but not anti. So in other words, the non-Aristotelian system includes the Aristotelian as a special case. The key point is the shift based on Łukasiewicz and the Polish school in general, the shift away from a two-valued orientation to a multi-valued orientation. He made the point that the two-valued orientation is often useful. There are many two-valued situations, if I jump in the water, I either swim or drown, so there's no middle, no excluded third. The multi-valued says that as an orientation, if all you got is two values, that's not enough to get along in life. You need a multi-valued orientation because many situations are not limitedly two-valued. So that's the core of what Korzybski meant by non-Aristotelian. The general semantics is the term that he gave to his method for applying these scientifically based insights into action. And we have things like the extensional devices. By extensional, Korzybski meant an orientation where one is oriented to facts, to observation, to ultimately events at nonverbal levels, which you're trying to figure out. So he created and introduced explicitly in the second edition, introduction also, what he called the extensional devices. And these are a series of techniques for avoiding allness, absolutes, and so forth. For example, dating. If we're going to talk about, say, Germany, it's very important in 2003 to recognize that Germany, 1933 to 1945, is not Germany 1970, when Willy Brandt went to Warsaw and later wreathed at the Ghetto Memorial. Is not Germany any time after that. That can be applied to any major noun. It can be applied to yourself. I, for instance, I, Bob Pula, 2003, am not Bob Pula, 1980 or 1947 when I graduated from high school. The only thing the same about me is my name. But what the name represents is different every second. And over significant stretches of time, markedly different. Every once in a while I'll see somebody I haven't seen for a while. They say, "Oh, Bob, you never change." I say, "That's what the hell you think." Related to dating is the notion of indexing. Most nouns are class terms. In fact, I suppose all of them are. We formulate class terms on the basis of similarities only, which we often mistakenly see as sameness is. Well, of course, no two things are the same. Some are mighty similar, but there are also differences. And the index, which is usually used as a subscript, reminds us of the differences within class terms. So, use the German example again. German sub 1, Beethoven is not German sub 2, Adolf Hitler is not German sub 3, Albert Schweitzer, who I guess was Swiss anyway, but Swiss German. And that's so important. I myself have so benefited from doing this kind of stuff as exercises and remembering it in my writing that, well, for one thing, I don't use terms like all and everybody. They have dropped out of my vocabulary. Oh, I might say with Socrates, all men are mortal, because the extensional evidence indicates that that's the case. But I certainly would not say all men are altruistic, or all men are vicious, or like Ron Smith says on the radio very often, well, that's human nature, with the implication being that all humans will do that, like go to war, commit murder, do whatever, because that's human nature, which is a fixed thing apparently for him, which he's never bothered to define, of course. But so it's a very liberating and humanizing series of techniques to structure your language in such a way that you don't make this mistake of treating members of the class as all the same. Reading Science and Sanity, if a person reads Science and Sanity and gets it, and that can take some work for some people, but if they do that, including the third part, book 3, which gives a lot of basic scientific data, I would say that that's equivalent to at least 3 years of college. There is discussion of literature and poetry, or references to it, but not much, analysis or presentation. So we can't quite give a bachelor's degree to somebody who reads Science and Sanity, but we can sure as hell give 3 years credit, as far as I'm concerned, especially if that person's going to be getting a degree in science.
So when was Science and Sanity written? What year? Was it finished and actually published?
Published in 1933.
Okay.
Macmillan was interested in publishing it, as so were a few other things, but Macmillan is the most important publisher that was interested. But they wanted to charge more than Korzybski wanted to charge for it. Korzybski wanted it to cost, this was, of course, in the Depression, and he wanted it to be priced at a level that most people, at least those who had a job, could buy it. And Macmillan wasn't willing to spend such a big one. He wanted to sell it for $5, which in the Depression was not a small amount, but it was too low for Macmillan, so they couldn't make an agreement. So Korzybski and Mira, his wife, decided they would publish it themselves, and they had it printed by the Science Press in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
briefly, how was it received?
He was received, uh, well, it was like a bombshell, as far as, yeah, as far as the reaction in the reading world is concerned, the academic world. Many of the leading scientists and formulators of various kinds of the time were very favorably impressed. Others were not. So it was a very basically, I mean, you consider that he was in great detail telling the majority of the uh, thinking community that they didn't know what the hell they were talking about. Uh, some people didn't take to that kindly. However, in the back, there are evaluations by some of the leading scientists, primarily of the time, and not just hard scientists, but what we call the soft sciences, like anthropology and so forth. Malinowski, Bertrand Russell, others. E.G. Bell, the mathematician, or the historian of mathematics, all wrote very favorable evaluations. But some others, notably Albert Einstein, did not. Actually, I have conflicting evidence about Einstein. Korzybski reports that one of his students who talked to Einstein about this book thought that it had a lot of merit, or quoted Einstein as saying so. But there's also another famous anecdote in which Einstein, when asked what he thought about science and sanity, said, "That's a crazy book." So the reactions were quite mixed, but very impactful. So much so that because Korzybski had so many requests for lectures and for study with him, that was precisely the reason why the Institute of General Semantics was founded in Chicago in 1938, so that there would be a place that people could come to study with the author of Science and Sanity.
Getting back to your
And
biography.
in fact, and right after, well, in as early as 1935, I guess, there was already a first conference on general semantics at the college in Washington State, Ellensburg College. And Korzybski started being taught, aside from all the lecturing that he was doing, being taught in lots of colleges and universities, sometimes taught as a separate subject in itself, notably at Northwestern University under Irving J. Lee, but very often as an aspect of a course in communications or English, speech, so forth and so on. So there was a terrific amount of response and influence.
Getting back to your biography, what do you hope to accomplish, number one, from having a biography out there, and number two, securing Korzybski's legacy?
What was that?
Securing Korzybski's legacy.
Oh,
What
yeah,
do you hope to
both
accomplish?
of those. Well, the first one was indefinite, but certainly the second. What I hope to achieve, first of all, is just making him and his work better known than is currently the case. But to let the thinking population of the world know that this stuff is available, and that if they study it and apply it, they can function better on a personal level, but also on a societal level, including all human activities. That's what has been driving me, we may say, without being fanatical about it, since 1960 or thereabouts.
Now, to wrap things up, we discussed, Korzybski's life, his infancy, the influences in his life, his writings. Between 1933 and 1950, when he passed away, a lot of things happened on this planet. The first one, obviously, is World War II.
Yeah. 1933 was the publication of Science and Sanity, the election of Hitler, and his appointment thereby as Chancellor of Germany, and the election of Franklin Roosevelt, plus a bunch of other stuff.
So there may be a lot of people out there who view Korzybski's writing as prescient, of value. But when you look at the carnage of World War II, of the insanity, so to speak, where does science and sanity fit into it all? Let's not forget, Korzybski's own country, Poland, was ravaged by World War II.
Indeed, he agonized over that throughout World War II.
Where is science and sanity?
Pins in it and all that stuff.
Where is science and sanity in the scheme of things?
I think the way to address that is to quote Korzybski in saying, "I do not give a panacea." What he saw himself as doing, apparently, is giving information organized as a system which, if applied, could ameliorate, not cure, but ameliorate the human situation. In other words, he was quite modest, but he was convinced that if people did get what he was talking about and internalize it, as we say these days, and then act accordingly, apply what they have learned, that this would be a great boon to humankind.
Now, we have about a minute left. Describe what has happened with Korzybski's writings and his philosophy since 1933, and can you apply it today in our society?
Oh, sure. I do that all the time. I no longer do much teaching in general semantics, but I still do a lot of writing. I'm having a book of my selected writings called Knowledge, Uncertainty, and Courage, which will come out in 2004, published by Extensional Publishing in Pasadena, California. There's a lot of Korzybski on the internet these days. There's a European Society for General Semantics, an Australian society, various societies in the United States. The Institute is now merging with the International Society for General Semantics, and we've just made a down payment on our own independently standing building where we will have our seminars and lectures and so forth and so on, and do our publishing work. So the situation is a very active one at the moment. And as I've told my colleagues, I said, look, if you had 50,000 general semanticists in a stadium, what the hell would you do with them? No, what we have to do is each of us just move along, even if it's at a snail's pace, and make our contributions until we coagulate. And then the time-binding function will go on.
Well, thank you very much, Bob.
Cheers.